Look at this map. A perfectly straight 1,000-mile line cutting down the middle of the United States. Except it isn't a border, and it isn't a road. It's trees. Millions of them. At one point, the US government started planting a man-made forest from Canada to Texas. More than 220 million trees, stitched into the landscape like a scar you can still see from space. Why did the US build a tree wall through its heartland? And what happened next? To answer that, you have to look at the strip of land they chose to run it through. This is the Great Plains, a massive strip of land that runs from Alberta and Saskatchewan in Canada down through the Dakotas, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and into the Texas Panhandle in the United States. It stretches roughly 1,200 miles, about 1,900 kilometers from north to south, and up to 500 miles, around 800 kilometers across, covering close to 500,000 square miles of mostly open land. It's a hard place to live on. The region is semi-arid, rain is limited and unreliable. Most of the moisture coming off the Pacific is dumped on the western side of the Rocky Mountains. By the time those air masses cross the peaks and spill onto the plains, they've lost most of their water. Some years are wet, some years are dry. You don't always know what you're going to get. Then there's the wind. Prevailing westerlies sweep off the Rockies and run for hundreds of kilometers with almost nothing to slow them down. Winters can plunge below -30 degrees Celsius, summers can hit 40 degrees Celsius, and the air is constantly on the move. For thousands of years, this still held together. Native prairie grasses grew deep root systems that locked the soil in place. Bison herds could graze the surface without destroying what mattered underground. Fires burned across the landscape, but the plants resprouted from their buried roots. Even when drought hit, the system bent without quite breaking. Geographically, it's almost a paradox, a giant, flat, tempting space for farms and towns, but one that only stays stable as long as its thin layer of vegetation stays intact. Strip away that cover in a place this windy, and you don't just lose plants, you change how it behaves. So what happens when you do that across millions of acres at once? After World War I, wheat looked like a miracle crop. High prices and government encouragement pushed farmers across the Great Plains to plow up more and more of the native grassland and replace it with wheat fields. By the 1930s, millions of acres that had once been deep-rooted prairie were bare, exposed farmland. At first, it worked until the rains stopped. The drought of the early 1930s turned all that freshly exposed topsoil into loose powder, and then the wind took over. Look at a wind map of the Great Plains. Those prevailing westerlies sweep out of the Rockies, pick up speed across open ground, and funnel east toward the Mississippi River and beyond. Normally, grass roots would hold the soil, but now those wind corridors had become highways for dust. The worst storms hit the Oklahoma Panhandle, the Texas Panhandle, western Kansas, eastern Colorado, and northeastern New Mexico, the zone we now call the Dust Bowl. On April 14, 1935, Black Sunday, a single storm carried 300,000 tons of topsoil east. Dust clouds reached Chicago. They reached Washington, D.C. Ships in the Atlantic reported dust falling on their decks 300 miles offshore. This wasn't just a bad farming year. This was a regional system failure. A chunk of North America had stopped behaving like farmland and started behaving like a desert. And to stop that, the US was about to try something no country had attempted before: redesign its geography with trees. In 1934, the Prairie States Forestry Project launched with a simple but extreme idea: plant a massive band of trees running north to south, roughly 100 miles wide and about 1,150 miles long, from the Canadian border down into the Texas Panhandle. Why north-south? To cut across the prevailing winds. Storms sweeping east off the Rockies would hit these tree lines head-on, lose speed, and drop much of their dust before carrying it hundreds of miles further. This wasn't one continuous forest. It was thousands of individual shelter belts stitched across farms and field edges. Each belt might reach 10 to 20 meters tall, with taller trees in the middle and shorter shrubs on the edges to block low-level wind. The mix changed by latitude. In the Dakotas and Nebraska, hardy species that could survive brutal winters. Further south into Kansas and Oklahoma, species that could handle heat and summer droughts. In the Texas Panhandle, trees and shrubs adapted to even drier, harsher conditions. By the early 1940s, roughly 220 million trees had been planted inside this corridor. It was continental-scale landscape planning, a deliberate attempt to engineer how an entire region physically behaves. So what does a line of trees actually do to a landscape like this? Think about the wind first. A shelter belt that's 15 meters tall doesn't just block wind at that height. It slows the air for up to 15 to 20 times its height downwind. That's a strip of calmer air stretching a few hundred meters behind each belt. Wind speeds can drop by half in that zone, which means far less erosion, less sandblasting of crops, and less snow piling up in the wrong places. Then there's the microclimate. Behind shelter belts, humidity nudges up, summer temperatures dip slightly, and the air becomes more stable. In winter, the trees catch snow and hold it in place so it melts slowly into the soil instead of blowing into ditches and fence lines. Over time, that means more moisture where farmers actually need it. On the ground, the impact was simple. Fields protected by shelter belts tended to see more stable production and often 10 to 20% higher yields. Farmsteads clustered near tree lines for shelter. Rural roads followed these corridors because they were the safest, least windswept routes across open country. The Dust Bowl ended because farming practices improved and wetter weather returned, but the shelter belts helped lock that recovery in. They turned some of the most vulnerable soil on the continent back into farmland that could actually stay put. Fast forward to today, and those shelter belts are still visible, but not everywhere. In some countries, especially in the northern plains, you can still see dense networks of tree lines crisscrossing the landscape on satellite images. In others, they've been ripped out. Larger fields, bigger machinery, and center pivot irrigation made those narrow tree strips feel like obstacles instead of assets. Modern mapping projects show this patchwork clearly. Zones where shelter belts survive versus zones where they've almost disappeared, like fossil infrastructure slowly eroding from the land. But climate conditions are swinging back. The Great Plains is seeing more frequent droughts, hotter summers, and stronger winds. Water stress from the declining Ogallala aquifer is making irrigation expensive or impossible in some areas. Suddenly, farmers are reconsidering shelter belts. Trees use water, yes, but they also reduce the amount of water crops lose to wind and evaporation. It's a trade-off, but in some places, it's starting to make sense again. And the US wasn't the only country watching. In 1978, China launched its own version, the 3 North Shelter Belt, also called the Great Green Wall. It stretches over 4,500 kilometers along the southern edge of the Gobi Desert, designed to stop desertification and hold back sandstorms that were burying villages and choking cities. In Africa, the Great Green Wall runs along the Sahel from Senegal to Djibouti, an 8,000-kilometer belt of restored vegetation meant to halt the Sahara's southward creep and stabilize millions of rural livelihoods. Australia has its own networks of shelter belts fighting wind erosion and soil salinity across its interior. Here's the pattern. In the 1930s, the US quietly ran one of the first experiments in using lines of trees as continental infrastructure. Today, you can see similar green lines on satellite images from North Africa to northern China. The scale and the stakes have only gotten bigger. We've covered those projects in separate videos, so if you want to see how other parts of the world are building their own tree walls, you'll find the links in the description. The Great Plains sits at a crossroads. It's getting hotter, drier, and windier. In some places, 1930s lessons are being forgotten. Trees removed, soils exposed again. In others, those lessons are being remembered just in time. So here's a question. If we can engineer landscapes at a continental scale, what other geographic problems could we solve with green infrastructure? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you found this fascinating, hit that like button, share it with anyone who loves maps and big ideas, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. We'll see you in the next video.